ISO. It can be your best friend or your worst nightmare. Sometimes called gain, ISO should be your last adjustment used when it comes to using tools to adjust your exposure. It's another tool that seems like a simple concept on the surface, but if it's not used correctly, it can permanently ruin your shot. Yes, I mean ruin it. Today on Digital Film Dojo, we're going to go into what exactly ISO does to affect the camera's picture and the best practices to use ISO on your set. My name is Brian, and I'll be your sensei for today. So what exactly does ISO stand for? It stands for International Standards Organization. Wait, what? What does that have to do with cameras? Yes, it's an odd name, but it actually kind of does make sense when you look at the definition. ISO is the standard industry scale when measuring sensitivity to light. Still not making sense? Well, the name doesn't actually matter. Basically, all you need to know is the higher you make your ISO, the brighter your shot will be. Simple as that. Except, not exactly. It may sound like it does the same thing as Aperture, but there actually is a big difference between Aperture and ISO. While they both affect your exposure, changing your aperture is a mechanical process. When using ISO, it's more of a digital process. The aperture directly affects the amount of light that's coming into your camera, while the ISO really is just a filter that your camera has to add more light to your shot. And this fact is really important to keep in mind. While opening your aperture to make your shot brighter will never degrade your image, raising the ISO too high will eventually make your footage unusable. This is because raising the ISO doesn't just make the shot brighter, it also adds more grain to the footage as well. And once you get to a certain point, this grain just becomes too much to handle. Each camera has their own theoretical limit when it comes to ISO. This is usually the highest ISO level you can put your camera before things start to get too grainy. And this can vary quite a bit between different cameras. As a general rule for most DSLRs and cameras like the Blackmagic or the Red, the highest ISO you can go without getting too much grain is about 800. And 800? That's not really a lot when it comes to ISO. But with this fact in mind, a lot of camera companies have gone out of their way to make new camera products that can handle higher levels of ISO than the average camera on the market. These are cameras such as the Sony a7S, the f5 and f7, and the Canon C series like the C100 and the C300 and so on. These cameras can go into ISOs into the thousands and still have an acceptable picture. It's pretty amazing. But even though these cameras allow you to shoot in low light, it doesn't mean that you never have to use lighting on set again. You still will always want to use controlled light on set in order to shape the light the way that fits best for your scene. It's not all about exposure when it comes to lighting. It's about how your light falls on your subject in your shot too. Now, when it comes to a typical filming environment, you most likely won't have to crank your ISO to extreme levels. You'll want to set up your shots so you won't have to change your ISO much from shot to shot if you can. Keeping it consistent throughout the scene is ideal, because you don't want varying levels of grain between shots in your scene. If you have enough exposure tools in your disposal to not have to worry much about ISO, you might want to consider shooting on your camera's base ISO level. The base ISO level is the level of ISO in your camera that produces what filmmakers deem to be the best quality footage in terms of dynamic range. For example, the C100 Mark II, the camera I'm using right now, has a base ISO of 850. The Red's base ISO is usually 800. Cameras that shoot in S-Log, such as the A7S and FS7, have a higher base ISO of 2000. Now, as you expect, shooting at a base ISO can present some different challenges because these base ISOs are somewhat a little higher than normally you'd shoot at. Since you're strapped to that level of ISO, you want to make sure that you have other tools in your set to expect your exposure accordingly. This again is where ND filters come in big, because they're going to help you a lot because they won't affect any other things other than exposure. They just make your shot just a little bit darker. And you can still get those pretty cool filmmaker images like we want to get so bad. You won't have to compromise your settings at all. You'll find yourself getting some really amazing shots in the end. And people will love you forever. Now, when picking a camera for your shoot, ISO is something you should have in mind. If you're shooting at night with scenes with very little controlled lighting, you're going to want to have one of these cameras that can shoot at higher level ISOs and still have acceptable pictures. If you don't have a lot of access to tools to help your exposure and you're shooting in broad daylight, you might want to consider shooting on something like a DSLR or something that can go into very low ISOs. It can get pretty bright outside and you might find yourself having to go all the way down to 0 with your ISO if you don't want to affect your aperture too much. Now, like I mentioned before, some cameras have something other than ISO called gain. These are more common in camcorders. While I wouldn't always suggest using these types of cameras in traditional filmmaking sets, if you do find yourself using them, maybe for documentary purposes, you'll be using gain instead of ISO. But gain works pretty much just the same as ISO. The higher you bring your gain, the more light your camera gains. And again, the more grain you'll have in your shot too. But just be careful. These cameras tend not to have as many options when it comes to gain. Its increments are a little higher than ISO usually are in cinema cameras. So just as I mentioned with shutter speed in the last video, ISO level is something widely recognized by many seasoned filmmakers out there. But the difference with ISO as opposed to shutter speed, if you don't get your ISO right, not only filmmakers are going to notice, but everyone's going to notice. Everyone's going to notice how grainy and bad your footage is. So that's why it's extremely important to get your ISO right on set. It might not always be as obvious on your camera screen, and then when you see it on the computer or on the big screen, you're going to see all that grain all blown up, and it's not pretty. Nobody wants to be that guy. Don't be that guy. Just use your ISO properly. It's easy. So I hope these last series of videos have helped you learn a bit more about camera operations and the best tools you can use when you're exposing and making your shots look perfect. If you follow these steps clearly, there's no doubt your work will be elevated and people will notice. They may not know exactly what you did to make it look better, but they really will notice. But no matter how you set up your camera and how you set up your shots, there's no substitution for a good story, good lighting, and good editing. So you want to make sure you're on top of those aspects of your film as well. So if you want to learn more about filmmaking, be sure to subscribe for weekly video tutorials on all different types of filmmaking topics. Each week, or when I'm busy, every other week, I release a new tip, trick, or tutorial having to do with filmmaking or video production, ranging from all different types of topics, from editing, camera work, storyboarding, producing, anything that you can think of. As always, feel free to comment down below with any questions that you might have and any type of topics you want to cover in the future. With that, I hope you all have a nice week, and I'll see you for the next video. Bye, everyone.